Imagine this. You step onto a plane with your family calm, excited, just wanting to get home. You've worked your whole life with dignity, built everything with your own hands, and today you're simply a father holding your daughter's backpack. But before you can sit down, someone looks at you and decides you don't belong there, not because of your ticket, not because of your behavior, but because of who they think someone like you should be. And in that single moment, you have a choice. Do you rise up in anger? Do you shrink down in silence? Or do you hold your ground with the quiet strength of someone who's been tested before? Now ask yourself, if you were that parent with your child watching, what would you do? Would you fight back? Would you walk away? Or would you choose a different kind of courage? The kind that changes more than just a seat on a plane. If this question touches something inside you, a memory, a wound, or simply a truth you've seen in this world, then stay with me, because this story may feel uncomfortably close to home. Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more real stories that matter, stories that heal, challenge, and stay with you. The first-class cabin felt unusually still that morning. It was the kind of quiet that did not soothe you. It pressed against your skin. It made you aware of every breath, every rustle, every passing glance. Outside the wide window, the Texas sun washed over the airport apron at Dallas-Fort Worth. Ground crews moved like tiny figures on a bright stage. Fuel trucks hummed. A luggage cart rattled across the concrete. Inside the cabin of Horizon Atlantic Flight 227 people settled into their large leather seats. Some scrolled through their phones. Some adjusted the reclining controls. Some watched the slow dance of aircraft outside. And then there was the family in row 2. They had slipped into their seats quietly. No fuss, no dramatic luggage, no flashy outfits, no look at me energy, just presence, a gentle, steady presence. The man by the window was David Cole, mid-40s, tall, strong shoulders, a clean white shirt, the navy jacket folded neatly across his lap, a silver watch with a scratched edge. His skin glowed warm under the cabin lights. If you walked past him in an airport, you might guess professor or architect or someone who reads a lot but does not brag about it. You would not guess that he was a co-owner of this very airline. He never looked the part. He never cared to. Beside him sat Lauren Cole, composed, soft-spoken, with the kind of awareness that made her seem like she could read a room in seconds. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and scanned the cabin the way people in human resources often do, quietly, carefully catching details no one else notices. In the aisle seat sat their daughter Maya, 12 years old, bright eyes, a backpack decorated with stickers of bands and books she loved. Her feet did not quite reach the footrest of the first-class seat, so they swung back and forth, tiny arcs of restless energy. She glanced around with innocent curiosity, taking in every button, every pocket, every glossy brochure in the seat back. "Mom," Maya whispered, leaning toward Lauren, "the seats are so wide." Lauren smiled. "It's a long flight, sweetie. We want you to be comfortable." David heard it, and his heart softened. That was always Lauren, never showing off, never explaining their comfort as something purchased or deserved. Only something meant to keep the family at ease. David appreciated that. He appreciated many things this morning, but he also felt a small knot in his stomach that he did not want to name yet. A flight attendant walked down the aisle with a tray of drinks: orange juice, water, sparkling wine. She placed glasses gently in front of passengers in row 1, then row 2 on the far side, then row 3, but not row 2 on the left, not the Coles. The attendant never even paused at their row. Maya tracked the tray with her eyes. Her eyebrows pinched slightly. She looked at her parents, then whispered again, "Mom, didn't she skip us?" Lauren placed a light hand on Maya's arm. "Maybe she'll come back." But her eyes followed the attendant too. Her name tag read Karen Mills, 40-something, hair in a neat bun, lips painted in a muted wine shade, movements precise, expression firm. 15 years of flying had carved a certain posture into her spine, upright, alert, confident. And whether she intended it or not, it had also carved certain assumptions into her mind. To Karen, first-class passengers usually came with signals she recognized: tailored suits, monogrammed bags, expensive watches, the casual arrogance that dripped off people used to paying thousands for a seat. The Coles did not match the familiar picture. Too quiet, too simple, too out of place. It was not hatred, not open hostility, just doubt. A subtle, persistent doubt that had followed Karen for years whenever she encountered black passengers in first class. A doubt she had never examined deeply. A doubt she believed was simply professional instinct. A doubt she now carried like a shield. Lauren noticed the way Karen's eyes lingered too long, scanning, assessing, questioning. David noticed too. He always noticed. And he felt the knot in his stomach tighten just a little more. The overhead chime sounded. Karen stepped to the front and began the safety demonstration, her voice smooth and practiced. Every gesture was crisp. But when she finished and walked down the aisle again, her gaze locked onto the Cole family. She stopped. She smiled, but it was the thin, formal smile of someone doing something she did not fully trust. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. David looked up, calm as still water. "Yes, I need to verify your boarding passes," she said. Maya blinked. Lauren inhaled. David stared for a beat, then nodded gently. "Of course," he said. He reached into his pocket for his phone, opened the Airline app and pulled up the 3 digital boarding passes. He held them out. Karen did not take the phone. Not immediately. Instead, she leaned in close, studying the screen, as if she expected to find a flaw hidden in the pixels. She scanned each pass with the small handheld device clipped to her belt. Red light, green light, confirmation tone, everything matched. Everything was valid. But something in Karen's eyes said she still wasn't satisfied. "Thank you," she said politely. "I'll double-check a few things with the ground crew. Just a routine verification." Routine. Even though she had not done it for anyone else. Lauren exchanged a slow look with David. David kept his expression neutral, steady, unshaken. But inside, a memory flickered. A younger him. Standing in a corner store at 15. Being stared at, watched, followed, suspected. A look he had spent his entire adult life trying to protect his daughter from. He exhaled slowly. The plane began to push back. Engines hummed. Cabin lights softened. Karen stood in the front galley with the phone to her ear, speaking in a hushed voice. "Yes, the Cole family. That's right. Row 2. Aha, first class. Yes, can you confirm their booking? I just want to make sure everything is correct." From where he sat, David could not hear the words, but he could hear the tone. Suspicion has a sound. He had heard it many times. Lauren squeezed his hand under the armrest. Maya watched her parents for clues. Her small voice broke the silence. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" David turned to her, his eyes soft, his jaw steady. "No, sweetheart," he said. "You did nothing wrong." Maya nodded, but her face showed she did not fully believe it. And that more than anything cut David deeply. Moments later, Karen returned. This time her smile had vanished entirely. "Mr. Cole," she said calmly, "I need your family to move to economy while we verify the ticketing details. It will only take a moment." Lauren's breath hitched. Maya froze. David lifted his head, slow and deliberate. "On what grounds?" he asked. Karen straightened. "Sir, please follow my instructions. If you refuse, we will have to remove you from the flight." The cabin fell silent. Passengers looked up. Eyes turned. Whispers stirred. David did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He did not flare with anger. He stood with the quiet, dignified strength of a man who had learned all his life when to fight, when to wait, and when silence spoke louder than fury. He gathered his jacket. Lauren helped Maya stand. The family walked down the aisle toward the back of the plane. Every step felt heavy. Heavy in a way only people who have been judged without cause understand. David kept his eyes forward. He refused to bow his head. But inside, something began to shift. Not rage, something calmer, colder, sharper, resolve. They reached the economy cabin and found 3 seats together. Lauren tried to smile at Maya, tried to joke about the legroom, but her voice trembled. David sat quietly, staring at the screen on the seat back in front of him. After a long moment, he reached into his pocket. He unlocked his phone, stared at a name in his contacts, and dialed. His voice when he spoke was almost a whisper. "It's me," he said. "Activate the protocol. Flight 227, cabin crew incident." He paused. "I'm not repeating myself." Then he hung up. Outside, the engines roared. Inside, the world was about to shift. And no one in first class, not even Karen, had any idea who they had just pushed aside. The engine hum settled into a steady vibration as Horizon Atlantic Flight 227 climbed above the clouds. But inside the cabin, the air felt tight, pressed, like something invisible was sitting on everyone's shoulders. In row 2, the first-class seats sat empty. 3 polished armrests, 3 untouched drinks, 3 silent reminders of a mistake that no one yet understood except the man who had just been sent away. Or rather, the man they thought they had sent away. In the economy cabin, David Cole rested his hands on his knees, trying to breathe steadily. The seat felt smaller than he remembered from years ago. Narrow, cramped, walls closing inward. But he did not shift. He did not complain. He did not let the discomfort show on his face. Lauren studied him quietly. She recognized the stillness. It wasn't peace. It was restraint. A deep, controlled restraint that only came from being pushed too many times in life, pushed into corners, into assumptions, into other people's quiet prejudices. Maya sat between them, hugging her backpack on her lap. Her voice was small. "Dad," she murmured. "Why did she move us? We paid for the seats, right?" David turned his head gently toward her. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a weight no child should ever have to see. "Yes," he said softly. "We paid for them. So, why?" she asked again. Lauren glanced at her daughter, then at her husband. Her heart clenched. This was the conversation she always hoped they would never have to have. David inhaled slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "people see us and make assumptions that have nothing to do with who we are." Maya blinked, trying to understand, trying to piece together something that felt bigger than her 12-year-old world. "Is it because we look different?" she whispered. David didn't answer right away. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't want to bruise her innocence either. Lauren reached over and squeezed Maya's hand. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "some people have learned the wrong things. And when they don't question those things, they end up hurting others, even when they don't mean to." Maya nodded slowly, but her small shoulders slumped just a little. That tiny motion tore something inside David. He looked away, out the window, over the endless horizon of clouds glowing in the morning sun. Memories pulled at him, stores he'd been followed in, colleagues who had spoken to him as if he were less, business meetings where he was mistaken for an assistant instead of the executive leading the room. He had endured all of it quietly, patiently, purposefully. But seeing that look on his daughter's face, that was different. That was the one line he did not tolerate people crossing. And now someone had crossed it. A chime rang overhead. Karen Mills stepped out of the galley, straightening her uniform, smoothing the front panel with quick, nervous fingers. She scanned the first-class cabin, expecting everything to settle. But instead of calm, she found unease. Passengers whispered. 2 businessmen shook their heads. A woman in seat 1, a frowned in visible disapproval. Karen felt a twist in her stomach. Something about the way they looked at her didn't feel normal. There was judgment there. Not from her toward others, but from them toward her. She straightened, chin lifted, professional, collected, in control. At least that's what she kept telling herself. She stepped behind the curtain and dialed the internal line again. Yes, this is Karen in first class, she whispered quickly. Can we get confirmation on the Cole family's booking? They're sitting in economy now. I moved them just to be safe, but I need. She froze. On the other end, a voice cut her off sharply. Karen, stop. She blinked. Stop what she asked. This verification, the calls, all of it. Do not take further action. Karen straightened, confused. But I'm just following protocol. A long pause. Then, protocol has nothing to do with what you're doing. Her stomach dropped. Ma'am, she insisted, I'm trying to ensure the comfort of our passengers. Another pause. Colder this time. That is exactly the problem. Before Karen could ask what that meant, the line clicked off. She stood frozen, staring at the handset, breathing shallow. What did they know? What had she done wrong? Why was her supervisor suddenly speaking like she had committed a crime? Her pulse raced. She smoothed her uniform again and again, as if the fabric might steady her. She didn't notice the captain emerging from the cockpit with a pale face, moving with quiet urgency as he slipped behind the curtain toward the galley. But David noticed every shift. He watched the curtain ripple. He watched the captain disappear. He watched Karen disappear moments later. His fingertips tapped lightly on his knee. The protocol was in motion. Lauren leaned closer. David, she whispered, what did you do? He didn't look at her. I didn't do anything, he said softly. I simply made a call. Lauren's eyebrows gently knitted. A call to who? David's jaw tightened the slightest bit. Someone who understands responsibility, he answered. And that was all he said. But Lauren knew her husband. She knew the tone he used when he'd reached his limit, not emotionally, but morally. She also knew that this wasn't about revenge, never about revenge. It was about dignity, restoring it, protecting it, for their daughter, for themselves, for anyone who had ever sat quietly when the world tried to shrink them. Through the thin curtain, voices drifted out of the galley, hushed, tense, fast. The captain's voice came first, clipped and controlled. Karen, you need to understand how serious this is. Karen's reply trembled slightly. I don't understand what's happening. I did everything right. You didn't, the captain replied sharply. You singled out a family with valid tickets. You moved them without cause, and you triggered an alert you do not have the authority to trigger. I was trying to protect first class, Karen protested. The captain closed his eyes. Protect it from what he demanded. From paying customers, Karen swallowed. From the economy cabin, David heard only pieces of the conversation. But the tension was unmistakable. Lauren's fingers curled around his. This time, he squeezed back. Meanwhile, in the galley, Karen's world slowly began to tilt. The captain's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Then he froze. The color drained from his face. He lifted the phone to his ear. This is Captain Reeves. A voice answered, deep, authoritative, unmistakably executive. Captain Reeves, this is Jonathan Hale, Chief Operations Officer of Horizon Atlantic. Karen's knees nearly buckled. The COO. On her flight. On her line. The captain straightened as if an invisible string pulled him rigid. Yes, sir, he said quickly. I'm aware of the situation. No, Jonathan Hale replied. You're not. The captain swallowed. Hale's voice hardened. The passenger you moved is not just a paying customer. He is David Cole, co-owner, strategic board member, and the architect of our inclusion standards. Karen's breath caught in her throat. The captain stared at her with wide eyes. Hale continued. We received his alert protocol 5 minutes ago. I need a full incident report the moment you land. Effective immediately. Do not allow the attendant involved to have further contact with him or his family. Karen stumbled back against the galley counter. Her vision blurred. Her chest tightened. Her heart pounded. The captain lowered the phone slowly. Silence filled the small space. Then he spoke, quiet, firm, and devastating. Karen, what did you do? She shook her head, barely able to breathe. I didn't know, she whispered. David, sitting in economy, watched the curtain tremble again as footsteps approached. Karen emerged first, pale, shaken, her hands trembling. Behind her came the captain. He walked down the aisle, stopping right beside David's row. Passengers watched closely. He leaned down slightly. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly, "may I have a word with you?" David looked up, calm as ever. "Yes," he said, "you may." The aisle felt narrower when Captain Reeves approached. His shoulders seemed heavier than before, as if every step carried a weight he could not put down. Passengers watched him the way people watch a storm cloud drifting their way, quiet, expectant, unsure if it would pass or break open above them. David Cole looked up slowly, his posture calm, his breath steady, but his eyes held a depth that made you feel he already knew everything the captain was about to say. "Mr. Cole," Captain Reeves whispered again, "may I speak with you?" Privately, Lauren glanced at David, a subtle exchange, an unspoken agreement. David stood. He moved with a quiet dignity that made even the cramped rows of economy feel like a place built to accommodate him, not the other way around. The captain guided him toward the small space between the galley and the lavatory, barely large enough for two men to stand without brushing shoulders. But the moment the curtain fell shut behind them, David felt the air shift. He could see it in the captain's eyes: fear, embarrassment, responsibility. And underneath all of it, a kind of shame that didn't belong to him but to the uniform he wore. "Mr. Cole," Captain Reeves began, voice low, "I owe you an apology." David didn't speak. He let the silence settle. Sometimes quiet gave people room to be honest. The captain swallowed. "I did not know who you were when we boarded," he admitted. "Not that it should matter. But I want to be transparent." David's face remained unreadable. "I received a call from the COO. Then another from Operations Control. They informed me that you activated your executive incident protocol." Reeves shook his head lightly. "Sir, I've been flying for 22 years. I have never seen that protocol triggered before." David's jaw tightened just slightly, a sign that he understood the seriousness more than the captain did. "This situation," Reeves continued, "is now categorized as a Level 1 internal breach. That's the kind of classification we use for major safety failures, or legal threats, or violations involving the board." He paused to catch his breath. "Sir, this entire airline is on alert because of what happened to you." David finally spoke. "What do you think happened to me, Captain?" he asked quietly. Reeves closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I think you were profiled," he said. "I think you were doubted for no reason. And I think my crew, my responsibility, failed to treat you with the respect every paying passenger deserves." David's voice remained calm. "And what leads you to that conclusion?" Reeves hesitated. The words came out heavy. "Because when I listened to the playback of the calls, and when I heard the tone of her voice, it was clear she was not following procedure. She was following an assumption." David nodded once. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just acknowledging a truth that had been repeated too many times in his life. "I appreciate your honesty," he said. Reeves exhaled, relieved but nervous. "There's more," the captain added quietly. "The COO instructed me to correct the situation immediately. They want your family returned to first class, and they want Miss Mills removed from duty the moment we land." David looked past the captain toward the thin curtain that separated them from the rest of the plane. Beyond that curtain was his daughter, still hugging her backpack, still wondering why a stranger had looked at her like she didn't belong. "It's not about first class," David said finally. "It never was." "I know," the captain whispered. David studied him. Not with anger, with a deep, searching intensity. "Tell me something, Captain," he said. "If I were not who I am, would the airline care this much?" Reeves hesitated. David didn't let him answer. "Would you have come back here?" he asked quietly. "Would anyone have noticed? Would anyone have apologized?" Reeves' voice broke slightly. I don't know. David nodded again. He appreciated the honesty. That's the problem, David said softly. That's why the protocol exists. Reeves lowered his eyes. I understand. David placed a hand on the small metal counter, grounding himself. Captain, he said, I don't want special treatment. I want equal treatment. For myself, for my wife, for my daughter, for every person who ever sits on this plane. Reeves' voice trembled. And I want to make that right. David let a long moment pass. He wanted the captain to sit with the weight of those words, not out of punishment but out of meaning. Finally, he nodded. Then start by talking to your crew, David said. Not with anger. With truth. Reeves swallowed. I will. They returned to the cabin. Passengers watched them, eyes flicking from David to the captain and back again. Curiosity, concern, sympathy, shame. Karen Mills stood stiffly near the front of the cabin, her hands clasped in front of her, her face drained of color. When she saw David stepping out behind the captain, her breath caught in her throat. Reeves pulled her gently aside. Karen, he whispered, don't say anything yet. She began. Not yet, he repeated firmly. But Karen couldn't keep her voice steady. I didn't mean to offend him, she whispered. I was just doing my job. Reeves looked at her with a weariness that came from years of knowing when excuses were just excuses. Your job, he said quietly, is to serve with respect, not suspicion. Karen's jaw quivered. I didn't know who he was. That's exactly the point. Karen blinked rapidly as if the world had turned too bright. I only wanted to protect the cabin, she insisted weakly. Reeves' voice softened, but not kindly. From what Karen, she said nothing. Passengers kept watching. A slow, uncomfortable silence moved through the plane like a fog. David returned to his row. Lauren touched his arm. How did it go? She whispered. David sat down, breathing deeply before answering. They know, he said. All of them. Maya looked up. Are we going back to the front, Daddy? David turned toward her. Her small face, her worried eyes, her innocence wrapped around a question she didn't even know how to form. No, he said gently. Lauren looked at him surprised. Are you sure? Yes, David said. We stay here. Not because we belong here, but because they need to understand that a family doesn't lose dignity just because someone tries to take their seat. Lauren exhaled slowly, a mix of pride and sadness. Maya leaned her head on David's shoulder. Okay, she whispered. At the front of the plane, Captain Reeves walked to the intercom. He pressed the button. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice steady but weighted. I want to address a matter on board today. Karen's head snapped toward him. Her mouth fell open. Passengers held their breath. In aviation, Reeves continued, we carry people from every background, every story, every walk of life. And sometimes, we forget that a seat number does not decide a person's worth. A murmur rippled across the cabin. Today, the captain went on, a decision was made that did not reflect our values. For that I sincerely apologize. Karen closed her eyes. She had always believed she was fair, good at her job, professional. But now, with the captain's words echoing overhead, she felt as if every assumption she had ever made stood up inside her, demanding to be seen. Reeves continued, we will address this matter properly upon landing. For now, I ask that we all treat one another with the respect we each deserve. The intercom clicked off. Silence settled again, heavy, reflective. But in row 18, Maya slipped her small hand into her father's, and David felt something shift in his chest. Not anger, not victory, something else, something quieter, a determination that did not roar. It resonated, the kind of determination that builds change slowly, one honest moment at a time. He looked toward the front of the plane. The aisle stretched long and narrow, and he knew this wasn't over, not even close. But for the first time since the plane left the ground, he felt the story turning. Not for him, but for what came next. The cabin felt heavier after the captain's announcement. Not chaotic, not loud, just heavier. A collective silence spread across the rows, thick and reflective, like everyone on board had been forced to look into a mirror they didn't expect to face. Passengers adjusted in their seats, coughed softly, exchanged looks they didn't dare interpret aloud. Some turned back to their screens pretending nothing had happened. Others stole glances toward row 18 where David Cole sat with his wife and daughter. But no one, not one person looked at them the way Karen Mills had. Not anymore. David felt the shift. He didn't bask in it. He didn't crave the vindication. If anything, it made him tired. Not physically. A deeper kind of tiredness, the exhaustion of carrying someone else's ignorance on your shoulders, even when you didn't ask for it. Lauren sensed it. She leaned in just slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You okay?" David kept his eyes on the aisle, watching shadows move through the narrow space. "I'm fine," he answered, but his tone held a quiet ache. "I'm just thinking." Lauren rested her hand lightly on his arm. "About Maya, about all of us," he said. Maya was drawing in her sketchbook again, tiny, curved lines forming the shape of an airplane wing. Her shoulders were hunched, her pencil strokes softer than usual. David's throat tightened. He wanted his daughter to think of planes as wonder, not wounds. A soft thud came from the front footsteps, shifting. Karen Mills stood frozen by the galley curtain, one hand gripping the fabric as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. She watched the captain's announcement settle over the cabin like a slow falling sheet of snow. Passengers avoided her eyes now, not out of cruelty, out of discomfort. Karen felt exposed, naked in a way she had never felt before, not because she was evil, not because she intended harm, but because her assumptions had been stripped bare in front of a plane full of strangers. She stepped back into the galley, her breath trembling. She pressed both palms against the stainless steel counter, bending over slightly, as if her chest had collapsed inward. "What did I do?" she whispered to no one. Her voice cracked. She thought she was protecting the cabin, following her instincts, doing what she believed good service looked like. But now she could see it, the flaw in her thinking, the blind spot she had nurtured for years, the quiet prejudice she never questioned because the world around her rewarded it with nods and polite smiles. She lifted her head, staring at her reflection in the narrow oven door. Same uniform, same badge, same hairstyle. But the eyes staring back looked older, more fragile, more human. A voice broke the quiet behind her. "Karen." It was one of the newer attendants, Jessica Lee, mid-20s, soft-spoken, still learning the rhythms of the job. Karen wiped her cheek quickly. "Yes," Jessica hesitated. "I heard what the captain said." Karen tensed. Jessica looked down for a moment, gathering courage, then lifted her chin. I saw what happened earlier," she said. "And I think you should talk to him. Properly." Karen blinked. "Talk to who, Mr. Cole?" Karen stiffened immediately. "I can't," she said sharply. "The captain told me to stay away from him." "I know," Jessica said gently. "But at some point, you might need to talk to him for yourself." "For myself," Karen muttered, confused. Jessica nodded. "You look like you're carrying something heavy. And I don't think the airline's punishment will fix what's hurting you right now." Karen stared. The young attendant took a small step closer. "People don't change because someone threatens them," Jessica said softly. "They change because they face themselves honestly." Karen swallowed hard. It was strange hearing wisdom from someone 10 years younger, someone with less experience, someone who hadn't been hardened by thousands of flights and millions of faces. But sometimes youth sees truths age has grown blind to. Karen looked away. "I don't even know what I would say to him," she whispered. Jessica smiled sadly. "I think you'll know when the moment comes." The galley grew quiet again. But inside Karen something was shifting slowly, painfully, like ice beginning to crack after years of winter. Back in row 18, Maya leaned into her mother. She whispered, "Mom, is she going to get in trouble?" Lauren paused. It was a complicated question. Before she could answer, David spoke gently. "Maya, do you remember what we always tell you about mistakes?" Maya looked up thinking. "That everyone makes them," she replied softly. And David prompted, "And the important thing is what they do after." David smiled faintly. "That's right." Maya bit her lip. "So, what's she gonna do now?" David glanced toward the front. "I guess we'll see," he said. His voice was steady, but inside he wasn't sure what he wanted from Karen. Not punishment, not humiliation. What he wanted was understanding. Not for himself, for his daughter, for every kid who looked like her. The plane leveled into cruising altitude. Passengers began to relax again, though the tension still lingered like a faint echo. The drink cart rolled out, eventually pushed by Jessica. She paused at row 18, offering a warm, apologetic smile. "Hi," she said softly. "Can I get you anything?" Maya perked up. "Do you have apple juice?" Jessica smiled brighter. "I do. Just a sec." She poured the drink carefully, handed it to Maya, then turned to David and Lauren. "And for you too, water," Lauren said kindly. "Same," David added. Jessica nodded, then leaned just slightly closer to David. Her voice dropped to a confidential whisper. "I'm really sorry for what happened. I just want you to know that some of us are trying to be better. Truly." David studied her eyes. Clear, genuine, not performative. "Thank you," he said quietly. Jessica nodded and moved on. Lauren watched her go. "That one," she whispered, "is going to make a good leader someday." David nodded. He agreed. Sometimes goodness showed up quietly through small gestures, simple kindness, and the bravery to speak softly when silence was the easier choice. At the front, Karen watched Jessica interact with passengers, watched her smile, her empathy, her ease. Karen used to be that way, years ago, before cynicism crept in, before assumptions replaced curiosity. She took a shaky breath, then another. Her mind replayed the moment she had asked the Cole family to move. The look on the little girl's face, the confusion in Lauren's eyes, the quiet dignity in David's posture, and finally, the captain's words. "A seat number does not decide a person's worth." It looped in her mind over and over. Was that what she had done? Equated worth with appearance, assigned belonging based on a picture in her head. She pressed a hand to her chest. Her heart hurt, not from fear of punishment, from recognition. Recognition of a truth she had avoided for far too long. Karen looked down the aisle again. Row 18 seemed impossibly far away, but something in her gut nudged her forward. "Not yet," she reminded herself. The captain said, "Wait, but the moment will come." And when it does, she knew she needed to face it. Meanwhile, in row 18, David leaned his head back against the seat. He let his eyes close for a moment. He wasn't sleeping. He was listening, listening to the whispers around him, listening to the way the cabin breathed, listening to the subtle shift in how people carried themselves after the captain's announcement. He was listening for something else too, for the sound of resolution approaching. Lauren watched him quietly. "You're thinking again," she said. David opened his eyes slowly. "Yes," about what he hesitated, then answered honestly, "about whether change ever really happens." Lauren's face softened. "It does," she whispered. "Not all at once, not loudly, but it does." David looked at her. "Do you really believe that?" Lauren reached for his hand. "I married you," she said with a soft smile. "Didn't I?" He chuckled under his breath. The tension eased, even for just a moment. Maya took a sip of her juice and leaned across her parents. "You know," she whispered conspiratorially, "I think they're all scared of Daddy now." David laughed quietly. "I don't want anyone scared of me," he said. Maya shrugged. "Well, they should be scared of being mean." David paused. That simple statement landed deeply. Sometimes children said truths adults worked years to articulate. Lauren kissed Maya's forehead. "You're growing up wise," she whispered. Maya smiled. But David saw something else behind that smile, a fragility he wanted to protect and a strength he wanted to nurture. He looked down the aisle again. The moment was coming. He could feel it. A shift. A reckoning. A quiet turning point. Not for the airline. Not even for Karen. For all of them. For what kind of world they wanted Maya to grow into. David exhaled slowly. "We'll see this through," he murmured. Lauren nodded. "As a family." And in the soft hum of the cruising engines, something like resolve settled between them. Calm, deep, steady, like a compass pointing north, waiting for what came next. Turbulence shook the plane gently, the kind that felt more like a reminder than a threat, just enough to make passengers pause, breathe, and hold the armrests a little tighter. The lights dimmed as Flight 227 drifted deeper into its cruising altitude. A soft amber glow washed over the aisles, making the aircraft feel smaller, more intimate, as if every person on board was sharing not just a flight, but a quiet truth no one wanted to say aloud. David Cole sat still, eyes open, watching the seatback screen in front of him, though he wasn't truly watching anything. The steady hum of the engines gave rhythm to the thoughts running through his head. Thoughts he'd kept sealed for years. Thoughts he never wanted his daughter to witness. Thoughts that only surfaced when old wounds were reopened by new hands. Next to him, Maya dozed lightly, curled into Lauren's side, her small fingers looping around her mother's sleeve. Even in sleep, she clung to security. Lauren shifted gently, whispering to David across the top of their daughter's head. "You're carrying something heavy right now." David didn't answer immediately. His gaze traced the arc of the overhead bins, the thin curtain leading to first class, the faint shadows dancing behind it where the flight attendants moved. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I didn't think it would hit me this hard," he admitted. Lauren nodded, brushing her thumb lightly across Maya's knuckles. "You've protected her so well," she whispered. "But we can't protect her from everything." "I know," David said. His jaw tightened. "But I wanted her childhood to last a little longer." Lauren's eyes softened. "She's growing, and she's watching us. How we respond matters more than what happened." David looked at her. Her calm steadied him in ways nothing else could. "You're right," he murmured. "As always." Lauren smiled faintly. A small smile, a tired smile, a real one. Before he could say more, the curtain at the front shifted again. Only one person stepped through this time. Karen Mills. She didn't walk with her usual stiff confidence. Her posture was smaller now, shoulders slightly curved, chin lowered, steps hesitant. She paused at the front of economy. Stared down the aisle toward row 18. For a moment she looked like someone standing at the edge of a cold river, knowing she had to cross but unsure if she had the courage. David felt her presence before he even saw her. Some internal instinct sensed the shift in the cabin's energy, a subtle vibration signaling that something unfinished was moving toward completion. Lauren noticed too. She whispered, "She's coming." David inhaled slowly. He had already decided not to move back to first class. He had already decided he wouldn't demand anything, but he hadn't yet decided how he would face her. Karen took a few steps down the aisle, then stopped again when a passenger turned slightly in their seat to watch her. Judgment lingered in the air, discomfort too. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. Then she walked. One row, then the next. Her footsteps slow, like each step pulled at something deep inside her. When she reached row 18, she froze. David looked up at her calmly. Lauren sat straight, protective but composed. Maya still slept lightly, unaware of the weight hovering beside her seat. Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again. "Mr. Cole," her voice cracked. I need to speak with you." David nodded once. "Go ahead." Karen clasped her hands tightly in front of her. Her fingers trembled. "I want to apologize," she said. "But not because the captain told me to. Not because of the COO. Not because of consequences." She swallowed. "I want to apologize because..." Her words faltered again. She looked at the sleeping child beside him, and something inside her broke. "I saw your daughter's face," Karen whispered, "and it reminded me of my own son when he was young, confused, hurt, wondering what he did wrong." Her voice softened with a raw honesty that surprised even herself. "I took something from her today, something I had no right to take." She looked at David, her sense of belonging. The cabin fell silent again. David didn't speak. He didn't fill the space. He let Karen continue. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, she said, her voice shaking. "And somewhere along the way I started thinking that I could tell who belonged in first class just by looking at them." She exhaled shakily. "That's not protocol. That's not policy. That's not professionalism." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "That's bias." Lauren watched closely, measuring sincerity, weighing truth. Karen kept going. "I've justified it for so long. I told myself I was protecting the cabin, keeping order. But the truth is, I was protecting my own assumptions." She looked directly at David now. "And I'm sorry," she whispered. "Not for the consequences I'm facing, but for the harm I caused your family, for the message I sent your daughter, for the weight I put on your shoulders." David breathed slowly through his nose. Her words found their way into places he rarely allowed strangers to reach. Places even he didn't like acknowledging. Karen straightened slightly as if needing to face judgment without hiding. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "And I'm not asking for it." She clasped her hands harder. "I'm asking for a chance to be better." Silence stretched, long, heavy, human. Finally, David spoke. "What made you come here?" he asked quietly. Karen hesitated, considering her answer. Then she told the truth. "Because the hardest mirror to look into," she whispered, "is the one someone else holds up." David studied her eyes. There was fear there, but also honesty, and something else, something closer to humility. He glanced at Maya, her small head resting on her mother's shoulder, her breathing even. Then he looked back at Karen. "What you did," David said softly, "hurt my daughter, it hurt my wife, and it hurt me." Karen nodded, swallowing hard, but David continued, "You came here, you stood in front of us, you didn't hide. You didn't make excuses." He paused. "That matters." Karen's breath trembled. "I'm not the man you thought I was," David added. "But even if I were nobody in this company, my family still deserved better." Karen's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're right." David tilted his head slightly. "What will you do next?" he asked. Karen blinked. I think I need to learn again. Unlearn, maybe. I need training, reflection, something real, not just a policy checklist." She looked down. "And I'm ready for whatever comes." David nodded slowly. "Then I hope," he said gently, "that this moment becomes a turning point for you." Karen blinked rapidly, tears finally escaping. "Thank you," she whispered. "David didn't say 'I forgive you.' He didn't rush healing. He didn't pretend the moment fixed everything. But he offered her something else. A chance. And sometimes, a chance is more powerful than forgiveness." Karen stepped back. "Please let your daughter know," she whispered, "that she didn't do anything wrong." David nodded. "I will." Karen walked away slowly, lighter than before, though the road ahead of her would not be easy. Lauren watched her go. "She meant it," Lauren murmured. David nodded. "She did." Maya stirred, then rubbing her eyes. "Mom, Dad, what happened?" David smoothed her hair gently. "Someone apologized," he said. "For being mean?" she asked. "For not seeing us," David answered softly. "But they're trying now." Maya blinked. "Does that make it better?" David paused. Lauren answered first. "It makes it a beginning," she said. David smiled faintly. "A beginning," he echoed. Outside the window, the sky stretched endless and golden clouds glowing in the noon sun. Inside the cabin, something had shifted again, quietly, softly, like a small healing woven into the hum of the engines. Not a perfect resolution, not an easy one, but the start of something honest, and honest beginnings often lead to real change. The cabin grew quieter as the flight moved east, slicing through a stretch of clear sky over Tennessee. The turbulence faded, shadows softened. The hum of the engine settled into a long, steady breath, like the plane itself was calming after holding tension too long. In row 18, David Cole leaned back in his seat, eyes half closed, not in rest but in reflection. His body was still, but inside 1,000 thoughts moved quietly beneath the surface. Lauren watched him the way she always had, gently, carefully, reading the shifts in his breathing, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, the subtle tightening in his jaw that most people never noticed. Maya had fallen back asleep, her head now resting on David's lap, her small body rising and falling with each of his breaths. David placed a hand on her back, his palm warm against her steady heartbeat. He didn't want her to feel this kind of moment again, not on a plane, not anywhere, not from anyone who saw her only through the narrow lens of assumptions. But he also knew the world was not always kind. And his job as a father, as a man, as someone who carried a lifetime of quiet resilience, was not to shield her from every shadow. It was to teach her how to walk through them without losing herself. Lauren shifted beside him just enough that her shoulder brushed his. "You're thinking too hard again," she whispered. David exhaled through his nose. "I can't help it. Want to talk about it?" "Not sure I can," he admitted. "Not yet." Lauren nodded, accepting the answer without pushing. That was the way they had always been, gentle when pressure would do harm, firm when silence became too heavy. Up front, the curtain rustled again. This time it was Captain Reeves, stepping out, his expression composed but carrying the kind of unease that comes only when a leader realizes he must fix something he didn't break but is still responsible for. He walked down the aisles slowly, stopping to speak quietly to a few passengers who seemed unsettled. He nodded, apologized softly, checked that everyone was comfortable. He wasn't doing it out of fear. He wasn't doing it because corporate told him to. He was doing it because he understood that the culture of a flight wasn't shaped by manuals or policies, it was shaped by the smallest human interactions, row by row, seat by seat, moment by moment. When he reached row 18, he paused. "Mr. Cole," he said gently. David looked up, his expression neutral. "Captain." Reeves glanced at Maya sleeping across their laps. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he whispered. "May I speak with you for a moment, both of you if possible?" Lauren nodded. David shifted slightly so the captain could crouch at eye level. Reeves cleared his throat softly. "I wanted to tell you something," he began. "Something I didn't say earlier." David waited. "It's about responsibility," Reeves continued. "About leadership." Lauren's eyes softened with quiet curiosity. Reeves kept his voice low, private. "I've seen many incidents on flights," he said. "Arguments, fights, people refusing to follow instructions, people treating crew poorly. But I've never seen anything quite like today." David didn't respond, letting the captain find his words. Reeves continued. "When I listened to the recordings," he said, "I thought the most painful part would be hearing what my attendant said, but it wasn't." He swallowed. "The painful part was hearing how calm you stayed." David raised an eyebrow, not expecting that. Reeves pressed on. "You didn't yell, you didn't threaten, you didn't make a scene, you didn't try to humiliate anyone. You were treated unfairly. And your response was dignity." David studied him silently. "In my experience," Reeves added, "it's the quiet people we underestimate the most. The ones who stay composed even when they're disrespected. Those are the people who carry real strength." He took a breath. "I just wanted you to know, I saw that, and I respect it." A soft stillness settled around them. For the first time since boarding, David felt something like understanding, not perfect, not complete, but real. "Thank you," he said quietly. Reeves offered a small nod. Lauren leaned forward slightly. "Captain," she whispered, "you didn't have to say this. But you did. That means something. Reeves gave a tired smile. I'm trying, he said. Then his face shifted as if remembering something. There's one more thing, he added. Operations Control has requested a landing escort. They want to meet with you immediately after we arrive. Lauren frowned. Is that necessary? Reeves hesitated. Given the executive protocol Mr. Cole activated, yes. David breathed slowly. He knew this moment was coming. He knew the call he made wouldn't stay inside the quiet walls of row 18. What exactly are they expecting? Lauren asked gently. Reeves lowered his tone even more. An incident report, a formal statement, and a conversation about next steps. David closed his eyes briefly. Next steps? They always sounded heavier than they were. He opened his eyes again. All right, he said simply. Reeves nodded again. Thank you for your time, he said. And again, I'm sorry. He stood and walked back up the aisle, leaving a quiet wake behind him. Lauren turned to David as the curtain closed. How are you feeling? She asked. David stared at Maya. I don't want her to remember this flight, he said softly. Lauren exhaled. Maybe she'll remember something else, she whispered. The way you stayed calm. The way you handled it. David let out a quiet breath. I hope so. Farther up the cabin, Karen watched the captain return from the back. She watched the slight sag of his shoulders. She watched the look on his face. Not anger, not disappointment, something deeper, something she didn't have a word for yet, but she felt it. Jessica approached her gently. Are you okay? She whispered. Karen shook her head. No. But maybe that's good. Jessica tilted her head. Good, Karen. Looked down the aisle again toward row 18. I've been comfortable for too long, she murmured. Comfortable in my assumptions, in thinking I knew who belonged where. Maybe it's time I wasn't comfortable. Jessica placed a hand lightly on Karen's arm. Growth isn't comfortable, she said softly. But it's worth it. Karen nodded, eyes misting again. I hope so, she whispered. Back in row 18, the plane began a slow descent, the engines lowering in pitch. The seatbelt sign chimed. David brushed a hand through Maya's hair, waking her gently. Sweetheart, he whispered. We're getting ready to land. Maya stretched, rubbing her eyes. Are we going back to our seats? She asked, groggily. David smiled softly. We're staying right here. Maya nodded sleepily. Okay. She leaned back into her seat, unaware of the world rearranging itself around her. Lauren looked at David. This won't end on the plane, she said. I know. Are you ready? David looked out the window as the aircraft dipped beneath a layer of thin clouds. The skyline of New York glimmered faintly in the distance. Yes, he whispered. I'm ready. Not because the airline was waiting for him. Not because the executives were preparing statements. Not because policies might change. He was ready because his daughter deserved a world where her worth wasn't questioned by strangers in uniforms. He was ready because silence had never protected anyone from bias. He was ready because change didn't come from anger, it came from honesty. The landing gear extended with a deep thud beneath them. The sky brightened. The world tilted upward. The runway rushed to meet them. And somewhere inside David Cole's chest something shifted. A resolve, a purpose, a direction. The kind a man finds not in victory, but in responsibility. The wheels touched down with a long, trembling shudder, one of those landings where the entire cabin seemed to exhale at the same time. The sky outside was a muted gray, the kind that draped over New York like a reminder that even the brightest cities carried their share of heaviness. Inside the aircraft, the seatbelt sign remained on a little longer than passengers expected. A few people exchanged glances. Some whispered. Others simply waited, sensing that something about this arrival wasn't routine. Row 18 remained quiet. David watched the terminal slowly grow larger through the oval window. His reflection stared back at him, calm but edged with something deeper. Not anger, not fear, responsibility. Lauren laid a hand gently on his arm. You don't have to carry it all at once, she murmured. He didn't look away from the window. It was easier when it was just me, he said softly. But now he stopped. His eyes drifted to Maya, who was tugging at her seatbelt with sleepy fingers. Lauren followed his gaze, then leaned closer. "And that," she whispered, "is exactly why you're the right person to handle what happens next." David didn't reply. He didn't need to. Those words settled quietly inside him, grounding him the way Lauren always did. The seatbelt sign finally chimed off. Passengers immediately reached for overhead bins, but a firm announcement echoed over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. For your safety, we ask that everyone stay in their seats until further instructions." A hush fell. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier conflict exchanged knowing glances. A young woman in row 5 muttered, "This is about that family, isn't it?" An older man beside her nodded slowly. "I think this flight's about to make the news," he whispered. Up front, behind the curtain, Karen stood frozen in place. Her heart thudded painfully. Her throat felt tight. Her palms were damp. Jessica hovered nearby, her expression tense but composed. "You okay?" Jessica whispered. Karen swallowed. "No." Jessica didn't try to comfort her with cliches or easy words. She simply stayed close enough that Karen didn't feel alone. And maybe for the first time in her career, that was what Karen needed most. Captain Reeves stepped out of the cockpit again, but this time his posture was different. Still calm, still in control. But there was a weight in his eyes that no uniform could hide. He walked slowly toward row 18. Every head turned, every whisper faded. As the captain approached, David straightened in his seat, placing a steady hand on Maya's shoulder. Lauren sat beside them, serene but alert. Reeves crouched slightly eye-level, respectful human. "Mr. Cole," he began, "Operations has requested that you and your family disembark first. Not fancy words, not corporate phrasing, just clear and honest." David nodded once. "Understood." Reeves continued, "There will be a reception team at the gate. 2 representatives from executive security and a liaison from corporate affairs. They will escort your family to a private meeting room." Lauren's brows lifted slightly. "A meeting room?" she asked softly. Reeves hesitated just a fraction. "Yes, ma'am. It's standard when a shareholder-level incident is triggered." David didn't move, but something about his stillness made even the air around them feel heavy. "Captain," he said quietly, "was that your decision?" Reeves shook his head. "No. This came directly from the top." David's jaw tightened the way it always did when he was thinking, not reacting, not resisting, just processing. Lauren reached for his hand. He squeezed back gently. "When should we go?" David asked. Reeves exhaled. "As soon as we reach the gate. I'll signal when the path is clear." David nodded again. Reeves turned to leave, but he glanced at Maya first and spoke in the softest tone. "You were very brave today," he said. Maya blinked up at him, unsure how to reply. Lauren smiled reassuringly. "Say thank you, sweetie," Maya whispered. "Thank you." Reeves offered a small smile in return, then walked toward the front. Across the aisle, 2 passengers whispered, "He's the owner, right? Co-owner, I think. Doesn't matter, she shouldn't have treated him that way." Another passenger murmured, "I hope they fire someone for this." But David heard none of it. The voices faded into a dull hum. Inside him, everything was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence where memories slip in without permission. Memories of his early career. The boardrooms where he was mistaken for an assistant. The conferences where security questioned his badge twice. The nights he returned home exhausted, telling Lauren, "It's fine," although they both knew it wasn't. He had endured all that. But today wasn't just about him. It was about every man who had ever been told he didn't belong. Every woman who had been disrespected in silence. Every child who had watched their parents shrink under someone else's assumptions. He would not let Maya grow up thinking this was normal. Not today. Not ever. The aircraft door finally opened. Cold air from the jet bridge swept in. The captain signaled, "Mr. Cole, whenever you're ready." Lauren stood first, smoothing her blouse with one hand and taking Maya's hand with the other. David rose slowly, steady as a mountain. Passengers parted wordlessly, creating a clear path down the aisle. People didn't stare out of curiosity now. They watched out of respect. A man in his 60s murmured, "God bless you, son," as David passed. A young woman whispered, "Your family deserves better." Another man said softly, "We saw what happened. We're with you." David nodded politely but kept walking. Lauren could feel the shift in the air around them. Not sympathy, recognition. Unlike pity, recognition carried weight and responsibility. At the front of the cabin, Karen stood rigid. Every instinct inside her screamed to speak, to apologize, to take back the hours that had played out like a slow-motion wreck. But her throat closed. Words stuck. Her chest tightened. And she watched helpless as the family she had hurt approached. Jessica whispered urgently, "Karen, say something." Karen shook her head, tears burning at the edges of her vision. "I can't," she breathed. "Not like this." As David stepped past her, he finally met her eyes. Not with rage, not with triumph, with truth. And the truth in his gaze was almost unbearable. Karen's breath hitched. "Mr. Cole," she whispered, barely a sound. David paused. But only for a moment. Then he simply nodded, a gesture that acknowledged her without absolving her, and he walked off the plane. Karen pressed a hand over her mouth as a quiet sob escaped her. Jessica pulled her gently into the galley, whispering, "It's not too late to learn, but you need to face it." Karen nodded against her shoulder. "I know," she whispered. "I know." Outside the aircraft door, 3 corporate representatives stood ready. 2 wore dark suits with discreet security pins. The third, a woman in a slate-gray blazer, stepped forward with a practiced but respectful demeanor. "Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole, Miss Maya," she said. "Welcome to New York. My name is Elise Romero. I'll be your liaison today." David gave a polite nod. "Thank you." Elise lowered her voice. "We've prepared a private room. The COO is en route. The legal director will join shortly. They are taking this matter extremely seriously." Lauren watched Elise's face, reading the sincerity behind the polished professionalism. David simply said, "Good." Elise motioned gently. "This way, please." As they walked down the jet bridge, Maya tugged at David's sleeve. "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart, are we in trouble?" David's chest tightened. He knelt down, meeting her at eye level. "No," he said gently, "we're not the ones in trouble." "Then who is?" David brushed a hand through her curls. "People who forget that everyone deserves respect," he said, "no matter what they look like." Maya nodded slowly, absorbing the words the way only children could. Maybe one day she would remember this moment. Maya nodded supple with a moment. Maya nodded supple. Maya nodded. Maya nodded. Maya nodded. Maybe one day she wouldn't. But one thing was certain. Today she was learning a lesson the world had tried to hide from her. Not a lesson of pain, a lesson of truth. And the truth, even when heavy, was something David wanted her to face with clarity, not fear. He stood, took her hand, and continued forward. The walkway from the jet bridge to the terminal was quiet, too quiet for a New York afternoon. Security staff walked a few paces ahead, clearing a path without being intrusive. Elise Romero moved beside the Cole family, guiding them with calm professionalism, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed how closely she understood the weight of this moment. David held Maya's hand. Lauren walked slightly behind them, her eyes absorbing every detail, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the distant chatter of airport staff, the stiffness in everyone's gait. She had always been the kind who noticed the small things before the big ones. They reached a frost glass door marked Executive Conference Suite 4C. Elise paused. "Before we go in," she said gently, "I want you to know the team inside understands the gravity of the situation. No excuses. No minimizing." David nodded once. Lauren gave a soft but firm, "Thank you." Elise opened the door. Inside, the room was larger than expected. Neutral gray carpeting, 2 long tables, a corner coffee station untouched, a wall of windows overlooking the runway where planes moved like distant silver birds. Waiting at the far end was Jonathan Hale, COO of Horizon Atlantic, tall, sharp suit, expression deeply serious but controlled. He had the look of a man who had spent the last 2 hours on calls he wished he never had to make. As David entered, Jonathan straightened. "David," he said quietly. "Lauren, Maya." Lauren offered a polite nod. Maya gave a small wave, half hidden behind her mother. Jonathan exhaled. "Please sit." The family settled into 3 chairs facing the main table. Jonathan remained standing a moment longer, hands braced on the back of a chair as if steadying himself. Then he sat. Elise closed the door behind them and took a seat near the corner, leaving space but staying ready. A soft hum from the air vent filled the room, underscoring the silence. Jonathan leaned forward. "I want to start by saying one thing," he said. "I'm sorry." His voice didn't shake, but it carried something rare, plain human sincerity. David didn't speak. He let Jonathan continue. "What happened on that plane is unacceptable," Jonathan said. "Not just because you're a shareholder, not because of your position, but because no person, no family should be treated with disrespect." Lauren's gaze softened a little, but her guard stayed up. Jonathan continued. "We have retrieved the internal cabin recordings. We have the communication logs. We've spoken with the captain. A beat. And we are not here to defend anything." David took a slow breath. "That's good," he said quietly, "because there's nothing to defend." Jonathan nodded. "We agree." Maya fidgeted slightly in her seat. Lauren placed a gentle hand on her knee. Jonathan looked at her with a softened expression. "I'm sorry you had to see any of it," he told her. "You deserve to feel safe, not confused." Maya nodded shyly. David's jaw tightened, but only briefly. Something in him appreciated that Jonathan addressed her directly, not as a footnote, but as part of the harm. Jonathan shifted his attention back to David. "We want to hear from you," he said, "before we take any next steps, before we finalize disciplinary action, before we release any public statement." David studied him. "How much do you already know?" he asked. Jonathan met his eyes without wavering. "I know the facts," he replied. "But facts aren't the whole story. I want to understand the impact. Not on paper, from you." David looked down at his hands for a moment. They were still, calm, steady, but inside thoughts tumbled quietly. Memories of his early career, of silent humiliations, of the repeated pattern of bias that shaped so many years of his life. He had built companies, sat on boards, written policies, changed systems, and still moments like today reached into him like a cold hand. He inhaled deeply. "Jonathan," he began when that attendant looked at us. "She didn't see a family. She saw a problem." Jonathan's face tightened. "And when she told us to move," David continued softly, "she didn't question whether she was wrong. She questioned whether we belonged." Lauren reached over and intertwined her fingers with his. David continued. "It wasn't about a seat. It was about dignity. About what my daughter learned today." He glanced at Maya, then back to Jonathan. "She learned that even when you're calm, even when you follow every rule, someone can still decide you don't deserve the space you're standing in." A long silence stretched. Jonathan swallowed. "David," he said slowly, "you're right. And it's our responsibility to change that across the entire airline, not just in this incident." Elise leaned forward slightly. "We've already suspended the flight attendant pending full review," she added. "But this goes beyond one employee." Jonathan nodded. "This is systemic," he said, "and it demands systemic correction." David studied him for a long moment. "Then tell me something," he said quietly. "Are you willing to change the system or just make this go away?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. He leaned back slowly, resting his elbows on the armrests, his expression shifting, not defensive, not offended, but contemplative. I won't insult you with a quick answer, he said. You deserve something honest. He took a breath. Systems don't change because companies want to look good, he said. They change because someone forces them to face what they've ignored. David said nothing. Jonathan looked directly into his eyes. And today, that someone is you. The room grew still again. This silence was different, thick, aware, waiting. Jonathan continued. We want your guidance, he said softly. Not to save the airline's image, but because you understand what's broken better than any policy manual ever will. Lauren's throat tightened. David looked down, processing the weight of those words. Jonathan added, we want you to help shape the reform team. Tell us what needs to change, where the blind spots are, what training has to look like, what accountability should be. David lifted his gaze slowly. Not just symbolic, no, Jonathan said firmly. Structural, enforceable, measurable, David exhaled. Lauren watched him, knowing exactly what that breath meant. Another responsibility, another fight, another chance to shift a system that had ignored too many voices for too long. Maya leaned close and whispered, Daddy, yes. Are we going to fix something? David smiled softly, the kind of smile that held a whole life's worth of strength. We're going to try, sweetheart. She nodded, satisfied. Jonathan cleared his throat gently. There's one more thing, he said. A matter of internal protocol. Elise slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed statements, timelines, transcripts. David didn't touch it. What is this for? He asked. Jonathan replied, transparency. We want you to have every record of what happened, every word spoken, every decision made, no filters. Lauren blinked, surprised. You're giving him everything? She asked. Yes, Jonathan answered. Because that's what respect looks like. The room fell quiet again, but something had shifted, not tension, not fear, possibility. Finally David leaned back. All right, he said softly. Let's talk about next steps. Jonathan nodded, relieved but composed. We're listening. They talked for nearly an hour. Not about punishment, though consequences were necessary. Not about corporate image, though media storms were coming. They talked about culture, bias, blind spots, training, accountability, real structures, real protections. At one point David hesitated, his voice dipping low. In my early 20s, he said quietly, I used to fly standby because I couldn't afford anything else. I remember once being told the first-class cabin was too full, even though I could see empty seats. Lauren squeezed his hand. Jonathan listened without interrupting. David continued. I didn't fight it then. I didn't want to be that guy. But I promised myself, if I ever had the power to change that experience for someone else, I would. He looked around the room, and here we are. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Here we are, he echoed. When the meeting finally paused, Elise spoke softly. Would you like a few minutes alone? David nodded. Elise guided Jonathan out, leaving the family together. Maya climbed onto David's lap. Lauren brushed his shoulder gently. You handled that beautifully, she whispered. He rested his cheek against Maya's hair. I just hope it leads somewhere. Lauren smiled softly. Change always starts in a quiet room, she murmured. Just like this. David closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him, tired, hopeful, determined. Outside the window, another plane took off, rising into the gray sky, climbing toward a space where storms eventually cleared. And somewhere inside David's chest, something lifted with it. Not victory, not relief. Resolve. The kind that builds movements not from anger, but from purpose. The meeting room softened into a gentle quiet after Elise and Jonathan stepped out, closing the door behind them. It wasn't an oppressive silence, not anymore. It felt more like the air after a storm, heavy but breathable, as though the room itself understood something important had just occurred. David leaned back in his chair, arms around Maya, her small head resting against his chest. Her breathing was soft, steady. The simple rhythm grounded him in a way words never could. Lauren watched them, both her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't tired, not exactly. but she carried a kind of emotional weight that only settles in after someone holds themselves together for too long. After several quiet minutes, she spoke. "You know," she murmured, "I kept thinking about what you told Jonathan, the part about your 20s, flying standby, being turned away even when seats were open." David didn't open his eyes. Lauren continued gently. "I never heard you talk about that before." He swallowed. "That was a long time ago." "Long," Lauren said softly, "but not gone." David exhaled through his nose a slow, measured breath. "No," he admitted, "not gone." For years, he had buried that memory beneath the layers of success he had built: business deals, keynote speeches, advisory boards, leadership titles. He had grown entire companies from nothing, raised funds, trained teams, written industry guidelines. And yet all it took was one moment on a plane, one pair of eyes filled with bias to dig back into that old wound. Lauren reached out and covered his hand. "I just want you to know," she said softly, "you handled today better than anyone could have expected, better than most people ever would." He finally opened his eyes. "I didn't feel calm," he said quietly. "I felt controlled, like I didn't have the luxury of losing control." Lauren nodded. "That's still strength." He didn't respond. She squeezed his hand a little more tightly. "And it's okay to feel tired now," she whispered. "You carried so much today." David rested his head back against the chair, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know if I carried it," he murmured, "or if it just dragged behind me until I couldn't ignore it anymore." Lauren's expression softened into something warm and deeply empathetic. "You didn't ignore it," she said. "You faced it, and not just for yourself." David's eyes slid to Maya asleep in his arms. "For her," he said quietly. Lauren nodded. "For her." A soft knock broke the quiet. Elise peeked inside. "Just checking if you need anything," she said gently. "Water, tea, a few more minutes." David nodded. "A few more minutes would be good." "Of course," Elise replied. "Take your time. I'll be right outside." The door closed again. David placed a hand over his face, then lowered it slowly. "I didn't expect them to ask for my help," he muttered. Lauren smiled faintly. "I did." He gave her a puzzled look. She tilted her head slightly. "You've always been the person people turn to," she said. "Even when they don't expect to, even when they don't know they should." David let out a soft laugh, tired but real. "You give me too much credit." "No," she said gently, "you just don't give yourself enough." He didn't argue. Another 10 minutes passed before Elise returned, knocking lightly. "David," she asked, "are you ready, or do you want a little longer?" David sat up, adjusting Maya carefully in his arms. "No, I think we're ready." Lauren rose, smoothing her blouse, brushing off imaginary wrinkles. They followed Elise out of the conference room into a quieter corridor away from the main terminal flow. 2 more representatives joined them, a security manager and an assistant from corporate affairs, who carried a tablet pressed tightly to her chest, as if it might fly away. "Mr. Cole," she said nervously, "I have the preliminary incident timeline prepared as well as a draft of our internal report. We can send it to you or review it together, whichever you prefer." David studied her for a moment. "What's your name?" he asked. She blinked, surprised. Olivia? Olivia Trent." "Olivia," he said softly, "I appreciate your work, but I'll review everything later. Right now I just want to leave the airport quietly." Olivia nodded quickly. "Of course, whatever you need." Elise led the group toward a side exit that bypassed the public arrival area. But halfway down the hallway, David slowed. "Wait," he said. Lauren turned. "What is it?" David exhaled. "I want to walk through the terminal." Lauren blinked. "Are you sure?" He nodded once. "Yes? I don't want to sneak out a side door as if I did something wrong." Elise hesitated. "There may be people, some passengers from your flight, possibly staff." "That's fine," David said simply. Lauren took his hand. "Then let's go." They turned around, and headed toward the main concourse. When they stepped into the open terminal, the usual chaos of JFK washed over them, rolling suitcases, echoing announcements, people rushing, people arguing, people embracing, people trying to find their way. But the moment they appeared, something unusual happened. People began to pause. A man waiting near the charging station recognized them first, then a woman near baggage claim, then a small group of passengers who had disembarked behind them earlier. One by one, heads turned. Not in shock, not in gossip, in acknowledgement. A woman in her 70s approached slowly, leaning on a cane. Her voice trembled with controlled emotion. "Son," she said, "I'm sorry for what happened to your family today." David nodded respectfully. "Thank you." A man in a business suit stepped forward. "If you need anyone to sign a witness statement," he said, "I'll do it." Happily. Another woman chimed in. It wasn't right. None of it was right. A younger man, probably mid-30s, pressed a hand over his heart. "You showed more grace today than most people ever could," he said quietly. David swallowed. Lauren felt his hand tighten around hers just slightly. Not out of anxiety. Out of emotion he didn't allow himself to show often. Maya looked around, confused at first, then curious, then proud as she sensed the warmth around them. "Daddy," she whispered. "They're nice." David crouched down, setting her gently on the floor. "Yes," he murmured, "they are." Maya looked up, her small fingers brushing the strap of his coat. "Does that mean everything is okay now?" David paused. Lauren watched him gently. He thought for a moment. Then he cupped Maya's cheek. "No," he said honestly. "Not everything is okay." She blinked. But he added with a soft smile, "Today is the start of something better." Maya nodded, accepting the answer in the clean way only children do. He picked her up again, and the crowd parted as the family continued forward, not with spectacle, not with drama, but with a quiet dignity that seemed to ripple outward, reshaping the space around them. Outside the terminal, the air was crisp. The sky still carried a muted gray, but sunlight broke through in small, brave patches. A black sedan waited at the curb. Elise approached David one last time. "We'll follow up with the full report," she said. "And Jonathan will call you tonight. We're committed to seeing this through." David nodded. "I know." And Elise added, her voice softening, "Thank you for how you handled today. It made a difference." David gave her a steady, grounded look. "It wasn't just for us," he said. "It never is." He opened the car door for Lauren and Maya, then paused before getting in. He looked back at the terminal, at the people who had spoken, at the quiet movements of an airport, slowly continuing on, unaware of the shift that had just begun. Lauren touched his arm. "Ready to go home?" David nodded slowly. "Yes," he whispered. "Home." He stepped into the car. The door closed softly, and for the first time since the confrontation, he finally allowed himself to breathe fully, deep, centered, human. Because the hardest part wasn't the conflict, it was what came after, and he was ready for it. The ride home from JFK was quiet. Too quiet even for a family that had grown comfortable with speaking through glances and soft touches rather than constant conversation. David stared out the window of the sedan as the skyline shifted, bridges, billboards, steel towers rising like jagged shadows against a faint afternoon sun. New York always moved fast, no matter what storms had come before. But today it felt like the city slowed down just enough to let him catch up with himself. Maya hummed softly in the back seat, tracing shapes on the fogged-up window with her fingertip. Lauren watched her, then looked at David. "Are you thinking about the meeting?" she asked gently. David shook his head. "No." "Then what?" He exhaled, leaning back against the leather seat. "I'm thinking about what comes next." Lauren nodded, as if she had expected that. "You mean the reform team that David said and everything else that follows?" Lauren hesitated. "Does it feel heavy?" David didn't answer right away. He had always carried weight well, responsibility, expectations, even disappointment. But today's weight came with a raw edge, something deeper than frustration or fatigue. "It feels necessary," he said finally. Lauren smiled faintly. "That's the difference between you and most people," she murmured. "You don't run from necessary." David looked away, letting her words settle quietly. When they finally reached home, a brick townhouse on a peaceful street lined with old maple trees, Maya rushed inside, first dropping her backpack and kicking off her shoes in a slightly crooked row. "Mom," she called. "Can we make cocoa?" Lauren laughed softly. "Of course. Let me change first." Maya bounded into the kitchen with the ease of a child whose day had not yet fully absorbed its weight. David stepped inside more slowly. The moment he closed the door behind him, his shoulders sagged not from defeat but from finally being somewhere he didn't have to stay steady for everyone else. Lauren came back to him, slipping her arms around his waist. "You're home," she whispered into his chest. David lowered his head against hers. "I know." Her warmth was grounding. He let himself rest in it just long enough to feel human again. Then the doorbell rang. Lauren lifted her head. David blinked. "Already?" he muttered under his breath. Lauren tilted her head. "Are you expecting someone?" "No." The bell rang again, this time longer, more insistent. David stepped toward the door with the cautious pace of a man, unsure whether the world outside had brought trouble or responsibility. He opened it and froze. Standing on his porch were 6 reporters, 2 camera operators, and a woman holding a microphone emblazoned with a national network logo. "Mr. Cole," she said breathlessly, "is it true? You were removed from a flight this morning by your own airline?" David blinked. Another reporter shoved forward. "Is it true the flight attendant refused to verify your ticket?" A man raised his microphone. "Did your family face racial profiling? Are you planning legal action?" David lifted a hand, not aggressively but firmly. "Please," he said, his voice low but steady. "This is my home." "We understand," the woman at the front said quickly, though her cameraman was already filming. "We won't take much of your time, just a statement. Anything. People want to know what really happened." David looked past them toward the street. Neighbors were beginning to come out onto porches. A delivery driver slowed his cart. 2 teenagers stopped on their bikes. The world had found him sooner than he expected. Lauren appeared behind him, wrapping a hand around his arm. "David," she whispered, "you don't have to talk to them." But he did. Not because he wanted attention, not because he wanted to embarrass the airline, not because he wanted retaliation. He needed to speak because silence created shadows, and he'd spent too many years walking through those shadows alone. He stepped forward onto the porch, keeping Lauren just behind him. "We'll keep it brief," David said. "Please stay off my property." The reporters stepped back, forming a loose semicircle. Cameras lifted. Red lights blinked. David took a breath. What happened today, he said, was not just about a seat or a ticket or a misunderstanding. He paused, not for drama, but to let the truth gather strength. "A woman made a judgment about my family before she looked at a single fact. And that judgment had nothing to do with policy." Soft murmurs moved through the reporters. David continued. "It was bias. Plain and simple." The woman with the microphone stepped forward. "Do you believe this was racially motivated?" David looked her in the eye. "I believe," he said slowly, "that when someone sees you as less or suspicious or out of place before they know anything about you, that is bias. And bias often has roots deeper than people want to admit." Another reporter asked, "Are you holding the airline responsible?" David hesitated. Lauren's hand tightened on his arm again. He spoke carefully. "I'm holding them accountable," he said, "and they've agreed to start making real changes. Changes I intend to help guide." "Are you pressing charges?" "No," David said. "This isn't about punishment. It's about transformation." A few reporters exchanged surprised glances. Transformation wasn't the word people expected. But it was the only one David could stand behind. He continued, "If what happened to my family helps someone else avoid being judged the moment they sit down, then today wasn't wasted." With that, he stepped back. We're done for now. The reporters tried to call after him, but he closed the door gently, not slamming, not hiding. Just done. Inside, he leaned against the doorframe, exhaling heavily. Lauren touched his cheek. You handled that beautifully. He shook his head. I don't want the whole city watching us. I know, she said. But sometimes visibility is the price of change. He rubbed a hand over his face. I just wanted to protect Maya. Lauren smiled softly. And you are, she said, by making sure this world grows up before she does. David let out a low breath. Maybe. She cupped his face with both hands. No, definitely. For the first time since the plane landed, David felt warmth push back against the cold edge of exhaustion. Then a soft voice drifted from the kitchen. Daddy. He turned. Maya stood in the doorway holding 2 mugs of steaming cocoa, one slightly overflowing from being filled too high. Her small eyebrows furrowed. Why are people outside? David knelt, taking 1 mug from her hands before it spilled. They just wanted to ask some questions, he said gently. About the plane, yes? Maya considered this. Are they mad? David smiled softly. No, he said. Not mad. Then, are they helping? David paused. Lauren watched him with wet eyes. Finally he answered. Some of them, he said. And that's enough for now. Maya nodded, satisfied. Then she smiled wide and sincere. Okay. Can we watch a movie tonight? David laughed, quietly shaking off the heaviness for a moment. Yes, he said. We can watch anything you want. Even as he spoke, he felt a subtle shift inside himself, something loosening, something settling. He wasn't done with this fight. But he wasn't alone either, and that made all the difference. Later that evening, after Maya fell asleep on the couch halfway through her movie, David received a text from Jonathan. We need to talk again tomorrow. There's been media inquiry, board meeting scheduled. We want you present. David stared at the screen for a long moment. Lauren sat beside him, touching his knee lightly. You okay? David set the phone down. I think so. Do you want to go? David looked at her. I think I need to. Lauren nodded slowly. Then we'll face it together. He took her hand. And as he looked across the darkened living room, the quiet lights, the soft blanket over Maya, the faint hum of the city outside, he realized something. Today wasn't the end of the storm. It was only the first ripple, and tomorrow the real waves would begin. But he was ready. Not because he was unbreakable, but because strength didn't come from standing alone. It came from standing with purpose. Morning sunlight reached through the blinds like thin golden threads when David opened his eyes. For a moment he lay still, listening to the quiet of the house. A quiet so different from the hum of engines, the press of a crowd at baggage claim, or the distant echo of reporters calling his name. Lauren was already awake, sitting by the edge of the bed, tying her hair back. She looked peaceful, though he could see the thoughtful crease between her brows, a sign she had been awake longer than he realized. You slept, she said softly when she noticed him watching. Did I? David murmured. You did. Not for long, but enough. He rubbed a hand across his face, the fog of exhaustion pulling at the corners of his mind. Today's the board meeting, she added gently. Not as a reminder David didn't forget things, but as an acknowledgement of the weight waiting for him. David nodded slowly. What time is Jonathan expecting me? Lauren replied. You should eat something before we go. David sat up gradually, muscles stiff. I'm not sure I can swallow anything. Lauren smiled softly. You're going to need your strength. He exhaled, conceding the point. Downstairs, Maya was already halfway through her cereal, swinging her legs under the table. Daddy, she said with bright energy, are you going to the big meeting today? David paused. Yes, he said gently. I am. Are you going to fix stuff again? He hesitated. Lauren stepped in with a smile. He's going to help people understand what happened, she said, so they can do better. Maya nodded sagely, as if this was a mission of great and noble purpose. Can I draw something for you, Maya asked. David blinked. For me, yes, for your meeting? Something happy? David crouched so he could meet her eyes. I'd like that, he said. Maya ran off to fetch markers and paper. Lauren leaned close. She wants to help, she whispered. David nodded. I know. He wished the world could stay gentle for her a little longer. By the time they stepped into the car, Maya had pressed a folded drawing into his hand. A picture of 3 smiling stick figures holding hands, Daddy, Mommy and Maya, with a plane in the background. The words, "We belong everywhere," written in her imperfect handwriting across the top. David stared at it longer than he expected. Lauren rested her head against his shoulder. Take it with you, she whispered. Keep it in your pocket. He did. The headquarters of Horizon Atlantic was a tall, polished glass building on the edge of Midtown, a tower that gleamed like ambition itself. Every time David walked through its revolving doors, he felt 2 versions of himself collide, the young man who once saved up for budget flights, and the executive who now owned part of the company behind them. But today, walking into that lobby felt different. Like stepping into a courtroom where he was both witness and judge. Employees glanced up as he passed. Not out of simple recognition, most had seen his face on internal newsletters before, but out of reverent quiet, the kind reserved for someone who carried a truth too heavy to ignore. Jonathan was waiting in the elevator foyer, tie slightly loosened, eyes tired. Morning, he said. Morning. You ready? David nodded. Let's get started. As the elevator ascended, Jonathan spoke quietly. I won't sugarcoat this. Some executives are nervous. Some are embarrassed. A few are angry, but not at you. Angry at the situation, David asked. Jonathan shook his head. Angry that it makes them confront things they'd rather not. David nodded without expression. I'm not here to comfort anyone, he said plainly. I know, Jonathan replied. That's why it matters that you're here, the elevator chimed. The boardroom was large and bright, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. 12 executives sat around the long table, some with notebooks open, some with coffee cups untouched, all stiff with anticipation. As David entered, voices quieted. Jonathan motioned him toward the head of the table, his seat. Some board members straightened, surprised, but no one challenged it. David sat. Jonathan took the seat beside him. A woman at the far end, Margaret Chen, head of legal, adjusted her glasses. David, she began, before we begin, on behalf of the board, I want to acknowledge. David raised a hand gently. Before any statements, he said, I'd like to hear what you already understand about what happened yesterday. A murmur rippled through the room. Margaret looked around, unsure. David looked directly at her. Please, he said, start with what you know. Margaret nodded reluctantly. Well, she began, based on the cabin transcript and statements collected. The lead flight attendant engaged your family in a manner inconsistent with policy. She, inconsistent, David repeated softly. Margaret hesitated. Jonathan leaned forward. What she means, he clarified, is that the attendant acted with clear bias, unacceptable bias. David nodded but didn't look away from Margaret. And how, he asked, does the board characterize that bias? Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Another executive, Arthur Davis, senior VP of operations, jumped in. It was racial, he said bluntly. We all know it. A few faces tightened. Some looked relieved someone else had said it. David folded his hands calmly on the table. Good, he said. We're starting with honesty. Jonathan exhaled. David continued. Now tell me, what's the company's plan for preventing this from happening again? A woman beside Arthur cleared her throat. Well, we can review our training modules. No, David said gently but firmly. Training modules won't change a system. Another executive offered. We can discipline the employee. David shook his head. That's accountability, not prevention. The CEO of HR opened her folder. We can revise protocol. Protocols don't erase prejudice, David said quietly. The room stiffened. He wasn't attacking them. He was inviting them into a truth they had avoided too long. David leaned back. Let me tell you what you're missing, he said. Because you can't fix what you won't face. Every head turned. Lauren's words echoed in his mind. You don't run from necessary. He placed Maya's drawing on the table. Executives blinked, startled. This, David said softly, touching the paper, is what was at stake. Not numbers, not policies, not PR. A child's sense of worth. He let the moment settle. Then he spoke. Bias isn't a training issue. It's a culture issue. Culture starts at the top. That means us. No one looked away this time. David continued, voice steady, calm, almost gentle. We need a full structural review of hiring practices, evaluation processes, in-flight authority distribution, complaint handling, and crew accountability. He ticked points off on his fingers. We need real scenario-based training developed with community input. Not just videos. We need a blind audit system for bias-related complaints. We need transparency in disciplinary outcomes, not names but numbers. And most importantly, he paused, we need leadership brave enough to admit we've fallen short. Silence deepened, not cold, not defensive. Awake. Jonathan cleared his throat. I propose we form a bias mitigation council, he said. Chaired by David. Murmurs again. Margaret nodded slowly. That could work, she admitted. Arthur leaned forward. It needs real authority, he said. Not symbolic power. Jonathan looked at David. You'd have full oversight, approval power, access to every department. Good, David said softly, because this doesn't work otherwise. The woman from HR spoke gently. Do you accept the role? David waited. He thought of Maya. He thought of every quiet humiliation he had endured in his early career. He thought of the passengers on Flight 227 who whispered, "We're with you." He thought of the flight attendant Karen crying in the galley, broken but willing to change. Then he said, "Yes, I accept." A breath moved through the room, collective, relieved, committed. The CEO of HR stood. Then let's begin, she said. And for the first time the boardroom didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a turning point. When the meeting adjourned, Jonathan walked David toward the elevator. That was remarkable, he said quietly. No, David replied. It was necessary. Jonathan exhaled a small laugh. Your daughter's drawing, he said. That was the most powerful thing in the room. David smiled faintly. She's the reason I'm doing this. Jonathan nodded, and we're better for it. As the elevator closed, David looked out across the city one more time. For the first time since the plane, he felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not exhaustion, purpose. A quiet, steady, unshakable purpose. The kind that didn't fade when the room emptied. The kind that built something new where something old had failed. The elevator ride down from the boardroom felt different from the ride up. Earlier, David had entered the building with uncertainty curling beneath his ribs, uncertainty about how the board would respond, about whether the airline he partly owned was finally ready for the mirror he was about to hold up to it. But now, descending toward the lobby, he felt something unfamiliar settle inside his chest. Not victory, not relief, something steadier, something earned, purpose. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. The sunlight through the lobby windows was brighter now, warming the marble floors and casting long reflections across the glass walls. Jonathan walked beside him, but didn't speak. He seemed to understand David needed a moment with his thoughts. When they reached the glass entrance, Jonathan finally said, David, I meant what I said earlier. What you did in there, it mattered. David slipped Maya's folded drawing from his pocket, smoothing the creases with his thumb. It wasn't just me, he said quietly. That room listened because the story was bigger than me. Jonathan nodded. Still, he said, you gave it a voice. David didn't argue. He just looked at the drawing again, the three smiling stick figures, the plane, the words, we belong everywhere. He folded it carefully and placed it back inside his jacket. What happens next? Jonathan asked. David looked at him. We build, we correct, we repair. and we make sure this doesn't get buried once the media finds a new story." Jonathan exhaled a small but genuine smile on his face. "You're going to make some people uncomfortable." David shrugged lightly. "Growth usually does." Jonathan extended his hand. "Call me if you need anything." David took it. "I will." Then he stepped out into the sunlight. Lauren was waiting outside near the curb, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, watching the doors with that steady understanding she carried like a second heartbeat. The moment she saw him, she smiled, not the relieved smile of someone hoping for good news, but the knowing smile of someone who never doubted the outcome. "How'd it go?" she asked. David kissed her cheek gently. "We made progress." Lauren nodded. "I knew you would." They walked to the car together, hand in hand, moving with quiet synchronicity. Inside the car, David finally leaned back in the seat. "It wasn't easy," he said. "I didn't expect it to be," Lauren murmured. But they listened. At that, Lauren turned her head sharply, eyes brightening. "All of them, yes," David said, and not politely, honestly. Lauren exhaled deeply, as if releasing a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's rare," she said softly. "And powerful," David nodded. "It was the drawing," he admitted. Lauren blinked. "The drawing." He pulled it out again and handed it to her. Lauren stared at it for a long moment. Her lips pressed together, her lashes fluttered. And then tears formed, soft and quiet. "They're not just changing policies," David said gently. "They're changing culture, from the top down." Lauren touched the drawing with the tips of her fingers. "You made them see her," she whispered. "That's what changed the room." David stared out the window. "No," he murmured. "She made them see themselves." The drive home was calm, the city bustling around them in its usual determined rhythm. Honking taxis, commuters clutching coffee cups, vendors setting up carts with the stubborn persistence only New Yorkers carried. Life moved on. But inside the car, everything was still shifting. David checked his phone, messages from colleagues, texts from community leaders, 3 missed calls from someone on the PR team he wasn't ready to speak with yet, and a message from an unknown number. "Saw the news. Proud of you." Signed only with the initial T. David smiled faintly. He knew the handwriting of that initial, an old friend from his earliest business struggles, someone who knew the version of him that existed before boardrooms and shareholders. He put the phone down. Lauren watched him. "You're thinking again." "Always," he said. "Want to share." He hesitated. "When I was younger," he said slowly, "I used to think change had to come from shouting loud enough that people finally heard you." Lauren didn't interrupt. "But now," David continued, "I think real change comes the moment enough people are brave enough to listen." Lauren laid her hand gently on his knee. "You didn't shout," she whispered. "You didn't need to." David leaned back, letting her words sink in. They arrived home to find Maya sitting cross-legged on the living room floor building a Lego airplane with the intense concentration only children have. When she looked up and saw them, her face lit up instantly. "Daddy," she said. "Did they like my picture?" David smiled. "They did." "Did it help?" "It did more than help," he said. "It made them understand." Maya beamed, proud and innocent. Lauren knelt beside her. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "Daddy's going to help make sure what happened on the plane doesn't happen to anyone else." Maya nodded seriously, as if accepting a mission she hadn't asked for but understood anyway. "I'm glad," she said. "Because people were sad yesterday." David felt something pinch quietly inside his chest. "Yes," he whispered, "but today, we started fixing that." Maya leaned forward and hugged him tightly around the neck. David closed his eyes, breathing in the warmth of her small arms. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm not scared anymore." He held her a little tighter. "Good," he said softly. "You shouldn't have to be." Later that evening, after dinner, after homework, after Maya had been tucked into bed with her favorite blanket curled around her, David and Lauren sat on the couch sharing a quiet moment. The fireplace flickered in soft gold. The room felt safe, a small sanctuary carved from the edges of a difficult week. Lauren leaned into his shoulder. "What are you thinking now?" she asked. David took a long breath. "I'm thinking about the flight attendant." Lauren blinked. "Karen, yes." Lauren studied him. "Are you angry with her?" she asked gently. David shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Not angry." "Then what?" David stared into the fire. "I think," he whispered, "she has a long road ahead of her. But I also think she's willing to walk it." Lauren nodded. She looked shaken. "She should be," David said. "But she also looked like someone who might grow if she gets the chance." Lauren traced her fingers along his forearm. "And you'd give her that chance?" David nodded slowly. "Yes." "Accountability doesn't have to mean destruction." Lauren smiled, a soft warmth in her eyes. "That's why you're the one guiding this," she whispered. "Because you don't lead with anger. You lead with conscience." David let her words sit quietly. He didn't know if he deserved the praise, but he knew he had to try. For Maya, for Lauren, for the next person who sat in a first-class seat they earned only to be told they didn't belong. He placed Maya's drawing on the coffee table. Lauren looked at it, then back at him. So she whispered, "What happens tomorrow?" David smiled softly. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start building the council." Lauren rested her head on his shoulder. And the day after that, David exhaled a long, steady breath. The day after that, we start changing the sky. The next morning unfolded quietly in the Cole household. Sunlight slipped through the blinds in soft ribbons, landing across the kitchen floor, where Maya sat swinging her legs while eating cereal. Lauren brewed coffee, humming faintly, her movements gentle and familiar. And David rested for the first time in days, leaned against the counter, observing this little scene with a warm, grateful heaviness in his chest. This was the life he fought for. Not headlines, not boardrooms, not policy changes or press conferences. Just safety. Just belonging. Just a world where his daughter could sit in first class someday without being asked why she was there. When they finished breakfast, Maya ran off to pack her little pink backpack, filled mostly with crayons and folded drawings, and Lauren touched David's arm lightly. "You seem quieter today," she said. "I'm thinking," he murmured, "about yesterday, about everything that comes after." Lauren nodded slowly. "You don't have to change the whole world in 1 week," she whispered. David gave a faint smile. "No," he said, "but this week showed me we can start." Later that afternoon, David returned to Horizon Atlantic headquarters, not as a man demanding accountability, but as someone ready to build. The difference, though subtle, shifted something inside him. The receptionist greeted him with unusual warmth. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cole." He nodded politely and headed toward the executive floor. As he walked through the long glass corridor, employees glanced up from their desks. Some offered small nods, some smiled softly, others looked at him with quiet respect, like they were seeing him for the first time, not as a distant shareholder, but as a man fighting for something that belonged to all of them. David stepped into the conference room, prepared for the council's first working session. Jonathan was already there. So were Arthur, Margaret, Elise, and 3 new faces, representatives from community groups and diversity organizations. This was no longer a board-driven initiative. This was a movement, David. Margaret said, rising with a rare smile. "We're ready when you are." David took a seat, resting Maya's drawing, not the original, but a carefully scanned copy, at the center of the table. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to explain why this image stays here." Everyone leaned closer. "This isn't a symbol of what happened," David continued. "It's a reminder of who we're fixing the system for. Not for shareholders, not for the media, for people, for families, for anyone who steps onto a plane simply expecting dignity." Quiet agreement rippled around the room. Jonathan cleared his throat. "So what's first?" David straightened. "Training, oversight, accountability. But also something we've ignored for too long: culture. We change that, and everything else follows." Everyone nodded. So he said, let's get to work, and they did. For hours, the room buzzed with ideas, disagreements, plans, and resolve. Not perfect unity, but productive friction, the kind of honest debate that builds something lasting. By the time they adjourned in the late afternoon, David felt a new kind of tiredness, not the weariness of fighting, but the exhaustion that comes from building something worthwhile. Outside, the sun was setting. A soft amber glow warmed the skyline as David stepped onto the quiet rooftop terrace overlooking the city. He let the wind brush against his face. The air felt different today, lighter somehow, like the sky itself had shifted ever so slightly. Footsteps approached softly behind him. David turned. Karen Mills stood at the rooftop entrance, her uniform replaced by simple jeans and a navy jacket. Her hair was pulled back, no longer tightly pinned into place. She looked smaller, more human, more uncertain. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "thank you for agreeing to meet." David gave a small nod. Karen approached slowly, stopping a few feet away, hands twisting nervously. "I didn't want reporters. I didn't want a crowd. I just wanted," she swallowed, "to speak to you directly." David didn't respond. He simply waited. Karen took a shaky breath. "I can't undo what I did," she said. "And I'm not going to pretend it was a misunderstanding or procedure or anything neat like that. I judged your family the moment I saw you, and when you challenged me, I doubled down because I didn't want to admit the truth." She paused, voice trembling. "I was wrong. Not just professionally, personally, deeply." David looked at her carefully, not coldly, not warmly, just truthfully. Karen blinked rapidly, tears fighting their way forward. "I've been in training for the last week," she whispered. "Bias work, cultural sessions, hard conversations. I thought it would feel like punishment, but it felt like waking up." David exhaled through his nose, slow, steady. Karen gathered her courage. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not because of your title, not because of the media, because your daughter saw what I did, and no child should see their parents treated that way." Silence hung between them, gentle, solemn. David finally spoke. "What are you going to do with what you learned?" he asked. Karen's breath caught. "I'm going back," she said. "Not as who I was, as someone new, someone better, someone aware." David watched her closely. "And when you see another family board the plane, one who doesn't fit the picture you're used to, what then?" Karen nodded, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "I'll remember your daughter's drawing," she whispered. "I'll remember that belonging isn't something I get to decide." David's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then he said gently, "You're on the right path." Karen covered her mouth with her hand overcome. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not destroying me when you had every reason to." David shook his head. "Accountability," he said softly, "isn't destruction, it's direction." Karen bowed her head deeply. "Goodbye, Mr. Cole." "Goodbye, Karen." She left quietly. David returned his gaze to the horizon. That evening, back at home, the living room lights glowed warmly. Maya curled up on the couch beside him, tracing her fingertip across the scanned drawing now framed on the wall. "Daddy," she whispered. "Yes. Are people nicer now?" David smiled, gently pulling her closer. "Some people are trying," he said. "And trying is how change begins." Maya rested her head on his chest. "I'm glad you didn't yell at the lady," she murmured. She looked sad. David kissed the top of her head. "I didn't yell," he said, "because sometimes people need guidance more than punishment." Maya nodded sleepily. "I like the sky when it's soft," she whispered. David looked out the window. The sky was soft, lavender gold, fading into blue. "You know what I like," he whispered back. "What?" "That someday you'll fly without wondering who thinks you belong." Maya smiled, eyes half closed. "I belong everywhere." "Yes," David whispered, "you do." Weeks later, Horizon Atlantic unveiled a new mural at JFK Terminal B. A silhouette of a father lifting his daughter toward a rising plane, powerful, simple, undeniable. Above it, the words, "Belonging is our altitude." Travelers stopped to read it. Some took photos. Some smiled. Some slowed down just long enough to feel something shift inside them. And high above, as a Horizon Atlantic flight took off into the sky, a soft voice echoed in the hearts of everyone who needed it. Change begins with one voice, but it never ends there. The Cole family's story isn't just about discrimination. It's about very real moments, moments that many of us have silently endured, being judged by our appearance, being overlooked, being treated as if we don't deserve to be where we've worked so hard to be. The most important thing we can learn is, strength lies not in how we react in anger, but in how we maintain dignity when challenged. David taught us that calmness is not weakness. It is the choice of those who know their worth. It is the courage of those who know that change must come from awareness, not from anger. The story also reminds us that everyone can carry unconscious bias, but everyone can learn, come back, and become a better person. And sometimes the most healing thing is not punishment, but helping someone wake up to themselves. For older audiences, the lesson is even clearer. We can't choose how others see us, but we can always choose how we stand up. And when the younger generation looks at us, what they learn isn't the power of shouting, it's the power of integrity. Thank you for taking the time to stay until the end of this story. I hope it touched something in you, a memory, a lesson, or a belief that the world can still be a better place if each of us changes a little. If you find the story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to bring emotional and valuable content. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to write the next stories.